Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Philanthropy Pulse webinar, where we'll be discussing what the Pulse Report data says about the current and future state of giving. My name is Kara Christ. I am the Vice President and Head of the Corporate Marketing Team at CCS Fundraising. CCS, in partnership with the Chronicle of Philanthropy, are grateful you've chosen to spend the next hour with us, reviewing key insights and findings from our 2023 Philanthropy Pulse Report. A few housekeeping notes for today's program. During today's discussion, you are encouraged to ask questions at any time by utilizing the Q&A feature in Zoom. We will be compiling these questions for our speakers to respond to at the end of today's session. Closed captioning is enabled for today's program, and the slides, as well as a recording of today's discussion, will be available and sent to all participants by tomorrow. You will also receive a copy of the full 2023 Philanthropy Pulse Report. Our presenters for today are Greg Hagin and Kat Rosqueta. Greg Hagin is a principal and managing director at CCS Fundraising. He provides fundraising counsel and philanthropic advice to the nonprofit sector and social impact space. A member of the CCS Board of Directors, he co-chairs the Innovation Committee, serves on the Finance and Audit Committee, and also leads the firm's Philadelphia office as well as its systems and analytics practices. In his 20-plus years of experience, he has advised hundreds of executive leaders, philanthropic partnerships, and development initiatives that have raised collectively over $10 billion, positively impacting tens of millions of lives. An accomplished instructor and facilitator, Greg teaches at the Wharton School and the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania. Committed to the nonprofit sector, Greg currently serves on the board of the Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce and is a member of the Union League of Philadelphia, Chairman's Council for the Mann Center, Development Council for U.S. Soccer Federation, and the Sattel Institute. A graduate of the Wharton School and Boston College, Greg began his career in sports broadcasting with NBC Olympics in Sydney and Salt Lake City, then ABC Sports in Japan and South Korea for the FIFA World Cup. With a passion for global engagement, he has visited, studied, and worked in over 45 countries, including all 7 continents. Katherina "Kat" Rosqueta is the founding executive director for the Center for High Impact Philanthropy, adjunct faculty in the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice, SP2, and faculty co-director of High Impact Philanthropy Academy. Founded as a collaboration between SP2 and alumni of the Wharton School, the Center for High Impact Philanthropy is the premier source of knowledge and education to help donors around the world do more good. Before accepting her appointment to launch the center, Kat was a consultant with McKinsey & Company, a consultant to the founding team of New Schools Venture Fund, founding director of Board Match Plus, and program manager of Wells Fargo's Corporate Community Development Group. She has held numerous civic leadership positions and is currently the chair of the board of Candid, the world's largest source of information on nonprofits and foundations. In addition, she serves on the national board of Greenlight Fund and co-chairs Greenlight Fund Philadelphia. Kat received her BA cum laude from Yale University and an MBA from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. She and her husband, Michael, live in Philadelphia with their 3 children. Greg and Kat, I'll turn it over to you to begin today's discussion.
Kara, thank you so much to you and your team and to the Chronicle for partnering with CCS on today's discussion. And Kat, it's great to be with you. Excited for today's conversation and to learn with you and to really delve into the data and hopefully some of the insights and useful recommendations that will come out of this conversation. And certainly to all attendees, to friends, partners, guests, fellow fundraisers, thank you again for all that you do to lead out in this space and to learn and to collaborate with all of us. So thank you again, Kat. It's really great to be with you.
I'm delighted to be here, Greg.
It's an exciting conversation ahead here. So before we dive in fully to some of the survey data, and we'll get into plenty of that by a host of different topics and then even some sector breakouts, I think we did want to just pull back for a second and think about the giving terrain overall. And we'll see here over time, and this next page that we're going to go through isn't entirely new information, but it is important context. And that is that overall, we're seeing dollars up, donors down. The trend has been pretty steady over a period of time, as we're noticing here. And that's been navigating through a host of headwinds and challenges in the last 2 to 3 years, but even before that, through the Great Recession and a number of other things that you see here back to the early 80s. But we're seeing the high watermark of almost $500 billion that was contributed, and this was in 21. I think, Kat, we're going to have 22 data in just a few months, but this is through Giving USA. So on one hand, very encouraged about the trend, the positive trend of giving overall, and dollars that are flowing to charitable organizations. And we're even seeing that this piece was studied through the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. And this was through really the first 3 quarters of 2021 and how that looked. But on the other hand, donors are declining. And I think we've seen over that 20-year period that in current dollars, giving is almost doubled from roughly 240 billion to 480 billion. Now, inflation adjusted, it would be a little bit different, but total philanthropic participation in the US has gone from roughly 68% to, I think, Kat, for the first time ever, just last year, dipped below 50% of the US is contributing. So there are all sorts of reasons for that. And we're curious to look into it, but that's what we are seeing. What we're excited about, and really what the survey data reveal, and you can see here, this is broken down by budget size of survey participants and also fiscal year revenues overall, is that this growth is shared almost across the board. It's not just the organizations that have $500 million budgets or even $10 million in fundraising revenue. It also includes the $1 million organizations. If we look at the good performers, I think really the exceptional performers that are raising 10% more year on year with revenues as compared to everybody else. So this is really a headline here of shared growth really across the board. I think as we look to some of the next insights here, and how do we know this? It's really based on this survey that was conducted. This was in the fall of 22, so it is of relevance in terms of timeliness. Over 1,200 organizations, which is a pretty good representative sampling. You can see geographically about a third in the Northeast, and we have almost 1 out of 2 in the Midwest, and likewise in the South of about 20% or so, and also a global representation here of about 75 organizations from Canada, Europe, Asia, and even Australia. And by sector breakdown, human services all the way through associations, so more than 10 representative sectors. No surprise, they're a little heavier in higher ed and independent schools, coupled with health as well. And the individuals that have been responding to this survey, 2/3 of them were in head roles, meaning the CEO or executive director of an organization, or the head of fundraising overall, a chief development officer, or a VP of giving or advancement. So that's what we're finding here. I think if we turn to the next slide at this point, just kind of a roadmap of where we're going. Kat, we'd love to talk about the outlook for this year, and we have some responses on that, and would love your view in terms of how bullish or bearish fundraisers are feeling. I think the good news is more bullish, but would love your opinion on that. Secondly, would love to dig into some of the data around donor acquisition, but also retention. So good offense, good defense, as we were just joking about. Thirdly, diversifying your fundraising strategy. And in many ways, it's really about the growth opportunities that are available. So not just by programs, but more so where are there growth spots or segments that could apply broadly to all the participants on this call. And then finally, we'll probably go through 5 or 6 different sectors and what's unique to those sectors, whether it is arts and culture or faith-based or education, health, human services, and the like. And where is there some creativity and consideration between sectors that might be applicable overall? So as we go forward here, we'll take a look, and I think that this is revealing data. Just on the next slide, you'll notice that we, if just one on this one, just to contextualize this a little bit, I mean, qualitatively, I think that this is the environment, Kat, that we're in, right? There's certainly consideration around economics, around markets, around politics, no doubt, and there's woes and wobbles and worries and the whole thing, but also this consideration, of course, around talent. And that's from hybrid to that's for the war for talent, or how to build an effective DEI program, more inclusive and belonging spaces, but also the role of technology. I mean, we were joking, I don't know if we should be joking about it, but the new AI powered Bing and how superior that's supposed to be evidently to Chat GPT, and what possibilities does that maybe unlock for the sector overall. But Kat, would really love your reaction to this next piece of data that we have here. When you look at this by and in light of the possibility of whether it's a mild recession or a slow recession, some people are describing it as some volatility in the markets. I mean, last year the S&P was down, I think 18%. This year it's back up about 6% or so. Or inflation, I mean, even the cost to borrow and of capital is more than doubled from where it had been a year ago, probably even more than that at this point. But in light of all that, or within that context, most participants are expecting similar growth or greater increases, so stability or growth into 2023 versus 2022. And some of the greatest areas for this are major gifts. Almost if we neutralize the stay the same, we find that there's close to a 6-to-1 ratio of increase to decline on major gifts. I look at even deferred giving or asset-based giving, that's almost a 10-to-1 if you look at the 43% to the 4%, again, distilling for the stay the same. And on the other side of this, there's lower or limited optimism, more like a 2-to-1 on government grants. So you can see this all the way down by program channel and by fundraising outreach. If we move to the next slide here, I think more than anything, Kat, would love your views on this. I mean, are you surprised by anything here? How do you reflect on some of the confidences of survey participants? And is it a matter of just economics or anything else? So, essentially, do you agree with this optimism?
I'll say up front, I'm neither an economist nor a fundraiser. And as somebody who directs a center that focuses on the practice of high impact philanthropy, which includes understanding available evidence, temperamentally, I hate predicting. But what I will say from the slide you just showed, two things stood out for me. One is the fact that that gray bar, which was the one that indicated respondents who didn't think things were going to stay the same or improve, that was relatively small. And I think, this is only, is this right, Greg, the second year of this survey?
That's correct.
Okay. So I think part of it may be those of us who have had careers in the nonprofit social sector. I will generalize that we tend to be a pretty optimistic bunch. So that optimism, my hypothesis is that as you do the survey each year, there will be a fairly stable degree of optimism, because I think those of us who choose to work in the sector, that probably is a characteristic of many of us. I guess the other thing, though, given your earlier comment about donors down, dollars up, that suggests that philanthropy is really reflecting what we're seeing broadly in society economically, which is an increased concentration of wealth. And I think that is reflected in the data you showed regarding major gifts, right? And the use of assets, right? Those are the kinds of philanthropic support that are typically provided by wealthier individuals. And that is consistent with the increased concentration of wealth, which is reflected in the fact that the amount of money being donated is high, but it's coming from fewer people.
Fair observations on both accords, Kat. Fundraisers, as what we'd like to think, perennial optimists. So is there a selection bias there? But also to your point, yes, I mean, wealth creation, it's derivative function of philanthropy and where that concentration is. I think I was reading the other day that paper assets, financial assets in the US, it was between the low point of 2009, I believe that was March, and then all the way up for the beginning of the pandemic, because that kind of discounted itself before and just after. It's like a 4x factor from 22 trillion to 88 trillion dollars. So exactly your point that there probably is likewise a bit more confidence with major giving in that sense. Well, thank you for that, Kat. Maybe we could move forward here and talk a little bit more donor acquisition and retention. And we'll see on the next slide, and this speaks almost exactly to your point, Kat, about the country's most generous billionaires and how much more money are they contributing. But I think the larger story here is that individual giving continues to drive performance to it. Now, that's not to fully discount companies and foundations. Everybody has their role to play in this, but individual giving at 67% of charity, if you also factor in family foundations, which might be a third to half of all foundation giving and individual decision-making, plus bequests, that number actually gets closer to 80, 85%. And the shift year on year was a little bit flat. But I think what we're seeing, to your point, I mean, on the major giving spectrum, oftentimes we would talk in terms of a giving pyramid. And in some senses, it's more of an Eiffel Tower. I could even use that analogy that it's 1%, some of these campaigns contributing 90% of the dollars, 10%, as much as 95, 96% of the dollars, especially in these larger lifts or extraordinary undertakings. So this is a phenomenon that we certainly are paying attention to. As we go forward here, though, on the slide, I think the way we're seeing this is, and this can almost be like an offense-defense slide. I'm not talking about our Philadelphia Eagles, Kat, okay? I don't want to go there with the birds. That was tough with the Super Bowl, but great offense.
Still licking our wounds on that one, Greg.
That's too soon. I know it's way too soon, but you can see there's 6 out of 10 organizations are doing a pretty nice job in donor acquisition in the last 12 months. We think some of the challenge that we're seeing is on the retention side, which is the right side of the screen here. Just about a third of organizations are retaining 50% or more of those new donors. So that's a lot of work on the acquisition side, and then not to be able to convert. And a lot of times that's, those are impulse or moment to moment contributions. And how do we, in some ways, move from moment to mission, where that cause is a little stickier and becomes part of someone's philanthropic portfolio, whether or not they even think in those terms. So that is something to look at as we move on from this slide toward the next, and thinking about some of the top challenges that were raised by survey participants. We can see their donor acquisition actually increased as a challenge from 21 to 22. Retention right there. You can see some of these double-digit growth concerns, even the hiring and retaining of fundraising staff, data management or the architecture thereof, whether that's through systems change or design or thinking. And then some of these other ones, like securing more gifts of non-cash assets or blended contributions. But I guess the question here, Kat, is really based on your experience, and you work quite a bit with a whole host of philanthropists at the highest levels. What do you think, or what guidance would you give for organizations to better or best, position themselves to not just attract more donors, but to retain them?
Mm-hmm. So, as a university-based center, we're not advisors, we're not consultants, we develop knowledge for the field, and we're educators. So a lot of my experience and observations are based on the folks who attend our High Impact Philanthropy Academy. Those are individual donors and grant makers who aspire to create greater impact with their giving. So that's a self-selecting crowd, right? That they are that committed that they are seeking education on how to be a better donor. And so based on that, I guess one thing that I'd share that hopefully relieves some of the pressure from fundraisers is just a reminder that every individual has a unique philanthropic path. And that path is influenced by much more than what any nonprofit or any fundraiser does, right? It's affected by what's going on with their family, what's happening in their communities. You will see that donor interests change when they're looking for a school for their child, or if their parent starts developing Alzheimer's, or so there's some aspect of this, which is just, if you respect the individual path, you will not be able to retain donors because there are lots of factors that will shift them on that path. That said, something you said earlier is, how do we make the causes sticky? And I think that's where, at least for the folks that come to High Impact Philanthropy Academy, it's all about having confidence that the donations they're making are making the world a better place. And how do you give people that confidence? My colleague, Jacob Harold, the former president of GuideStar, no numbers without stories, no stories without numbers, right? That combination, again, at least with the folks that we teach, is what helps them have that confidence that the money that they are giving to the organizations they support is worth it and is doing exactly what they wanted to do, which is to advance the cause and make the world a better place.
Great perspective and advice, Kat, on both fronts in terms of there are donor journeys, there are also life journeys. And there are things that we can control or maybe influence or affect, and other things that we just can't. So let's focus on almost what we can. And I really value your counsel around that, it's a blend of the numbers and the stories. I think it was Christoph at one point also mentioned, if it's not one, then it's no one, meaning you need to show the data, but then also tailor and humanize and personalize the story as well, from impact that the cause and the commitment is really making a meaningful difference. So that's helpful to hear. Why don't we keep moving here? I mean, part of this also, as we've learned, and whether we describe it as donor loyalty programs, and you mentioned this a little bit about how do we create confidence between the donor and the organization. A lot of this, and we learned this, in fact, through the great financial recession back in 2008 and 9, principally, that the number one reason an individual donor stopped giving to an organization year on year was actually not the lack of finances or wealth from time, but it was the lack or loss of a connection, of a relationship with somebody. And I think that's really important to lift up here as well, in terms of building a relationship and really listening and leaning in with the donor and where their interests are. But why don't we keep pressing on just to this next slide of data that we're finding here. And there's a host of different practices and outreaches. And you can see here that the digital space and social media in particular continues to rise from importance of 21 to 22, and enhanced media presence, looking at new donor engagement, engaging in different ways, even personalized communications. Digital, right, still kind of trending there as we see it. Moving forward here, though, if we can look at the next slide, and this is, forgive us, Kat, but directly from Candid, though, right? Where we want to showcase that, and we want to lift that up to an extent of this notion of tailored or personalized information and communications, emails and otherwise. And also being invited to events. Being able to show up again and to connect again in person and hear stories and listen to these stories. And that's really strengthening meaningful connection. I am curious, of course, we don't necessarily have to go here in total, but this notion, all the talk nowadays of technology and AI and truly chat GPT, and to what extent can that be utilized or not? To what extent is it authentic or not? Does it create, or could it potentially erode a degree of trust? But where can certain tools be utilized, especially with reaching more people where they are, on the way toward building more personal relationships. But just on the next slide, if we could, as we go here, I think we would love to hear from you a little bit more, Kat. I mean, what are you seeing around donor engagement preferences? How is that shifting, whether it's relevant or related to demographics or tools or whatever that might be? Please.
Yeah, so if you're elevating two developments that I'm seeing and that my colleagues at the center and at Candid are seeing. I'll start with the last one that you mentioned, which is demographics. One of the things that's happened over the past 2+ years with COVID and with the killing of George Floyd is an increased understanding and appreciation of disparities based on race. And for many donors, wanting to address that means needing better data on who these nonprofits are that they're supporting, who's the leadership of those nonprofits, what communities are they serving. And that's demographic data that frankly has been super hard to come by across all the nonprofits that donors are considering. So one of the things that I am super proud of and excited about is that Candid, which as Cara said at the beginning, is the largest source of data and information on the nonprofit and foundation sectors, just launched yesterday our demographics via Candid, which can be a one-stop shop for demographic data of nonprofits. So that's one theme, and that I'm excited that we'll have new tools, new data tools for that.
Congratulations, that's terrific, Kat.
Yeah, and for those who are interested, like I said, there was an official launch yesterday, but there'll be a webinar March 28th for those who are interested in learning more and want to make sure that their organization's data is there. And then there's a ton of really interesting new technological tools. And I think it's really, as you pose the question, combining the two things that are in that first line, it's digital, but it still needs to be personalized, right? People give to people. And so I'm thinking of two efforts that have really launched over the past year. One is Keith Leaphart's Philanthropy, which is a way that individuals can track their giving, share their giving, round up using their American Express card to give. It's almost like giving the tools of a foundation to an individual. And then actually one of my mentees, a former Penn student, has recently started something called Chariot. And what Chariot does is it allows individuals, you see all these fundraising campaigns that people might do like for their birthday, and they're using social media. Chariot will allow folks to give to those campaigns drawing from their DAF funds, right? So it just makes it simpler for everyday individuals to be able to donate, to share who they're donating to, encourage others to join them. And I think it's digital, but it maintains that very personal connection that I think is part of what drives philanthropy. I mean, that's why we continue to see individual giving as the largest piece of that pie chart of where philanthropic funds come from.
That's great, Kat. And I appreciate you combining the two and drawing on that emphasis as well, the personalization and the creativity, the ease, the connecting, meeting people where they are. And those are two excellent examples. And we were all just with Keith Leaphart and Philanthropy, as we mentioned a few, whether it was Satel or even with CCS, but some real innovations in this space, which are very exciting at this time. Maybe we'll keep going here. I know we have some other content to look at, and this is there's a number of things to consider in this one. We have it diversifying your fundraising strategy, but really in three parts around asset-based giving, around talent investment, and around messaging for diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we see this as real growth opportunities across the board for survey participants. So as we go forward here, take a look at just having a growth mindset, but also investable growth strategies. And this is right from the Nonprofit Council, hoping to provide some additional financial flexibility and gearing up for greater success. I mean, not just in the near term, but building for success, a longer term, sustainable type of style. So we'll see here this first one when we think about these non-cash asset-based commitments and even the transfer thereof. I mean, we've both studied some of the literature on this, and I think for years, Boston College and the Center for Wealth and Philanthropy was running a study that the numbers are in the trillions, the tens of trillions of dollars. I think at one point it was $40 trillion in expected transfer almost in as many years, right? In 40 years. And at one point, even if 12 trillion of that or 10 trillion of that was going to go to charity over that time, that's not insignificant, right? That could be, and it's not going to be evenly distributed, but an extra, say, 200 to 400 billion dollars on a year going forward through some of this asset-based transfer. So we're trying to take a look at this. As we know, the whole sector is and understanding wealth dynamics, creation, and distribution in the country. But we wanted to highlight this as a real growth opportunity and what we're learning, and we think it's intuitive, but it's validating in the data as well, is that many of the larger organizations, probably as a reflection of resource or capacity or just even spatial distribution, are finding almost capturing a greater share of non-cash assets and based assets. So you can see here in that 20% range or up to 20% range. And that, in our experience, provides a little bit more of a diversified balance and portfolio year on year. Probably don't want it so high because then that's less predictable. But if it's too low, that means that organizations aren't benefiting from individuals who might name their nonprofit and lift it to almost the status of family by way of bequest or trust or some other type of giving vehicle. So just wanted to make that point. On to the next concept here about talent. And we'll see here, we're using similar vernacular in this instance of good performers and others. We also think about this, I think about this in great performers, exceptional performers. People are seeing the fact that it is year-on-year growth of more than 10%. And no surprise here as well. I mean, we're seeing a higher percentage of the good performers are both spending more money or investing more money, I should really say, allocating more budget investment to hire more fundraisers and more staff, and are also increasing compensation packages and looking at elevated pay over time as well. So there's a direct correlation to that and the performance of many of the nonprofits that participate here. So just moving forward to the next slide at this point, I guess I would ask, Kat, based on your research and your engagement, whether it's with both CHIP and Candid, any advice that you would offer around both attracting and motivating top talent as part of a growth strategy for organizations?
Mm-hmm. So a couple of things, and a lot of what we know about the talent needed for social impact organizations is actually in a workbook that we have that's available for free called Talent for Giving on CHIP's website. But particularly for nonprofits, two things. One is that I think there's a increased appreciation. I know it's the case on the two boards that I serve on, that you get what you pay for. And for too long, there has been a volunteer and charity mindset and an unhelpful focus on overhead as an indicator of effectiveness, all of which have led to nonprofits and their funders and their boards undercompensating for the kind of talent they really need to pursue their mission. So, we need to continue to take a hard look at what we're compensating. And you know, there's financial compensation for sure, but one of the things that we learned when we were developing Talent for Giving, and it was actually part of a job talk that one of my colleagues, Famita Handy, did at the School of Social Policy and Practice, is that when you choose this sector, or you choose any mission-based enterprise, I said earlier, I think the sector tends to attract the optimists. Don't stop by any means at financial compensation, right? There are certain industries where financial compensation is king. Investment bankers, private equity, for example. But in any mission-based enterprise like nonprofits, what two other factors are really important to attract and retain great talent, and that is recognition and understanding how to recognize them, who staff want to be recognized by. And then the second is an understanding of how what they do is tied to the impact that the organization has. And in some cases, nonprofits have a leg up there because of our missions and the good work that we're doing, that when we advance our impact, it helps everybody, right? But those three: financial compensation, recognition, and making sure that individuals in an organization can see really clearly how what they contribute is leading to the impact that the whole organization is driving towards.
It's really helpful, Kat. Thank you. I think our friend Adam Grant at one point even made that direct connection, right? Of fundraisers who are at a university level, and if they could see that their effort was directly leading to a connection and an impact that was tangible, and students that were benefiting, or prospective students that had a whole lift on morale and contribution and energy. And exactly to your point, the financial piece is an element, but it's not the whole thing. At the risk of going into Dan Pallotta and why charity is been wrong. By the way, there's going to be a new premiere of this film that's kicking off over the next several months, but the rule book of kind of one rule book for profit, one rule book for nonprofit, but at the risk of digressing there, but that's great advice, both around recognition and drawing meaning from the work in and of itself. So thank you for that. We'll keep going forward here. We have some additional content before we get into some of the sector reflections, but this continued focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just recognizing that the donor landscape is evolving. More female donors, donors of color, younger donors, and that means new messaging and new approaches and new commitments for impact. So we just wanted to emphasize this for a minute and even look at some of the different areas of opportunity and where performance matters within this space. Just on the next slide here, you'll see that on the left, we kind of look at, all right, organizations who consider this, the importance of DEI, even in the development of their strategy plans, to be extremely important or very important, are outperforming to an extent. And then some of the activities or the tactics or best practices associated with this, to no surprise, but it is nice to see here, continued training and education, creating awareness and allyship along the way, incorporating aspects of DEI into new projects and programs for actual funding. And then you can see here the messaging and reflections and a case for support or proposal or brochure in and of itself. So these are just some of the moves that we've seen and has been shared with us back through this survey of participants. So just on to the next slide, and to really gauge your thinking on this, Kat, are there other things that you've seen or anything else that you'd like to emphasize for our audience to help promote more diversity, more diverse perspectives, and as we have here, to truly achieve more inclusive solutions across the board?
So this question is at the heart of a project that we did recently. It was a collaboration between our team and the folks at MacArthur's Lever for Change. And again, this is a free toolkit on our website called Choosing Change. And it was the question was, how can funders assess proposals for their potential to address structural inequality? Now, I know we're using the term DEI here, but sort of behind that, like when you think of where there's disparities, where there is structural inequality, that is where, usually because of race, gender, geography, and socioeconomic class, certain people are not invited to be at the table. And so that's why I'm referencing that resource, because if what you're trying to do is promote diverse perspectives and achieve inclusive solutions, that really means involving different people than you've had before, right? In that Choosing Change toolkit that I mentioned, there were two dimensions that too often we found people weren't thinking about, and it was inclusivity, and not just inclusivity in terms of, you can have somebody who looks different making decisions than you've had before. But it's inclusivity in terms of, well, who's even deciding what's on the agenda? And so it's inclusivity, but also where is the power within the institution? Who's calling the shots? That's pretty deep internal work that a lot of organizations need to wrestle with, that goes far beyond any training of staff, though that is of course an element, right? Because it's almost like not just a training of individuals, it's a retraining of the institution if we're really going to be able to have the kind of inclusive solutions that people seek.
Absolutely. Yeah. At the core of an organization, at a governance level, at a fiduciary level, at a cultural level, and to your point, in involvement and kind of agenda setting and having presence and voice at the table and being mindful of those power dynamics. Let's take a look at the next several slides. We do want to get into these sector trends and insights, and then I believe we'll invite Kara to come back for a few minutes as well. We have a number of questions from the audience that is registered here in the chat function and otherwise. But why don't we take a look just on the next slide? The first thing that we did here is to just evaluate the reality that 6 of these 10 sectors have increased in whether it's budget size or at a minimum in philanthropic revenue that we're looking at. And you can see the typical breakdown of the share of faith-based, and also by way of education and health and human services, public society benefit with some of the DAF distributions, these donor advised funds that you had referenced earlier. And then on the right side, just demonstrating the increased popularity of online giving and online donations. And we need to double click on one of those it's a bit of a curiosity, even K through 12 education, and almost a matching component of there, whether that's from younger alums or from current parents, or maybe a whole host of factors. But broadly across the industry in each of these sectors, digital trends do continue. If we can look at a few of these one by one, I think we'll find arts and culture a great and a big emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also seeing more of an increase, not just in the revenues, but also in donors themselves. So there's definitely something to study a little bit deeper and be mindful of in arts and culture. If we think about the faith-based sector, what's happening there? Well, there's a pretty big reliance for most of these organizations, houses of worship or otherwise, on the annual appeal itself. So major gifts, they do play a role, no doubt, but you can see nearly 40 trending toward 50% of a budget from the annual appeal, capital campaigns, more of one-off projects or extraordinary circumstances. And just the key takeaway here too, the emphasis on stewardship. We have a diverse audience with us today, and also of participants who responded to the survey. You see 100% at a minimum of thank you and recognition, and all the way down the line here. I think just to switch to the next sector focus that we have, health. This is really interesting. This is where you see the emphasis on talent and retaining more fundraisers and hiring more fundraisers. And also, I think more of this tilt toward being fully centralized. So when you have kind of a headquarters and their local affiliates, or you look at this by service line or some kind of mix, but how is that going to play out in reality? I think we are seeing this two trends with greater investment and greater, I think, return on investment in the health sector, recognizing that a lot of these monies that are raised, it's almost, okay, if we invest $1 in philanthropy and can produce $3, $4, $5 in return that are unrestricted dollars, I mean, almost unencumbered monies, that's a great value proposition for these health organizations altogether. Just with the next sector, we're moving through here with higher ed. I think, again, we're seeing a bit more centralized organizational models in terms of the fundraising itself, but also major giving. It's really something, right, Kat? When you look at this as compared to some of the faith-based organizations, that almost inverts between the major giving and the annual fund. And it's no surprise, back to the comment earlier about the 4X on paper assets from 22 to $88 trillion and wealth creation and more of an Eiffel Tower look. On higher ed, typically, I think still it stands that 50% of seven-figure gifts and above are captured in this sector for a whole variety of reasons. Just moving forward on this one, if we could, human services, there's so many takeaways associated with this. The two that stand out for us from the data is that we're seeing more and more unrestricted giving, and whether that's McKinsey Scott by way of example, or whether that's by the Ford Foundation or some others, and you raised this briefly before, but relaxing certain constraints or that quote unquote overhead effect and having trust capital and having credibility and really allowing the organization to move that money to a greatest impact is definitely one. And then an ability to acquire donors. And as we mentioned before, can we move from the moment toward the mission to retain those donors and further steward them along the way? Just the next couple of sector cuts, and then we will open it up for some discussion here, but primary and secondary schools, we are seeing this, and it's pretty incredible. I mean, a majority of support, whether it's from parents, current parents in particular, but I think the transferable insight is even on the campaign work. I mean, this is pretty incredible that 2 out of 3, roughly speaking, organizations are either planning for a campaign, they're in a campaign, whether it's by way of design or even going public. And our research and data suggests that organizations campaign because it works. It helps to finance a strategic plan, can help tell a big story. It unifies messaging. And in most cases, it's helping organizations raise 50 to 100% more money in campaign cycles as compared to out of campaign cycles. And in many cases, sustaining those higher level revenues on the other side of the campaign. So no surprise here on the campaign impact as we have it. I think that about does it for the sector kind of reveal. But Kat, anything from your perspective, any surprises or anything that you think should be emphasized a bit more here?
I mean, no big surprises, because I feel like the data reflect the sectors, right? Where you see the role of major gifts at colleges and universities. And I suspect if you disaggregated that data, particularly with elite institutions like where I am at Penn, I guess the one thing that I find quite hopeful, and I hope is a trend that continues, is the increase in general operating support, particularly for human services organizations, because general operating support allows maximum flexibility in use of funds. And as we've all survived, the past 2 years and see the need for human services to adapt and be nimble, the more that we are able to support that adaptation and that nimbleness as the world throws things at them, the better that they can serve the communities that they're aiming to serve.
It's great, Kat. Thank you for those reflections on the sector trends and just overall throughout this dialogue on each of these topics and some of the key takeaways. I think we might have another 5 or 10 minutes, and I see Kara. Kara, welcome back. Thank you for joining us again. I don't know if we do want to talk a little bit, I'm seeing in one of these questions boxes here, probably dozens of questions, I mean, 35, 40, I see 47 different. So we're probably not gonna have a chance to get to all of them, but maybe 1, 2, or 3 in particular, and then we'll try and give everybody maybe a minute or two back in their days.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Greg and Kat. We have received several questions. We've been fast and furious behind the scenes trying to answer as many as possible, but 2 questions in particular are related that we thought we'd kick off this Q&A session with, and they are these trends of marginal increases in giving, but from fewer people is troubling. It's been going on for some time. So how do we inspire additional giving from those who are currently not participating? And that directly relates to another question that asks, how concerned should organizations be in the fall of donor numbers? Does it reflect, in your opinion, a long-term change in American society? Or as Kat seemed to imply by linking it to the recent trends in concentration of wealth. And is there anything nonprofits themselves can do to reverse that fall in donor numbers?
So there are 2 societal developments over the past decades that all correlate with what we saw in the report, which is dollars up, donors down. And that is a concentration of wealth, which I've already mentioned, and there's a decline in democracy. And if you think about philanthropy, especially in the United States, philanthropy is the use of private resources to serve the public interest. It is a deeply, in some ways, reinforcing mechanism for democracy. But on every framework that measures democracy, globally, there have been declines. And this is something that we looked at. Again, it's a free resource on our website, We the People, How Can Philanthropy Strengthen Democracy? So I offer, these are decades-long trends. And so I don't want to kid anybody that any one nonprofit fundraiser or set of organizations can reverse societal and political trends like that. The one thing to note, though, is historically in the US, we have measured philanthropy primarily by looking at tax records. And looking at gifts to tax-exempt organizations where there's a deduction taken. That's like the simplest way to do it. One thing to consider is having a broader definition of philanthropy and broader indicators of philanthropic support. And that might actually give us a rosier picture of who's involved in philanthropy than we're able to get right now, because I even mentioned some of those tools, but think of the GoFundMes. Think about, if you think of philanthropy as use of private resources to help someone other than yourself, then there's philanthropic activity happening everywhere all the time, but we're not counting it. So there's a little bit of a, yes, there are these broad societal and political developments over decades that are troubling. At the same time, we're not seeing the full picture of what philanthropy is just because of the limitations of our research methodologies right now.
It's really wise, Kat. You're right. Is it cultural? Is it something about democracy? Is it more just measurement and what we're capturing or what we're not? Like Charities Aid Foundation, maybe that's a little broader and looks at truly traditional time, talent, treasure, or some element of that. Would you help a stranger or a neighbor? To what degree, and how is all that value captured as such? And it is interesting, Kara, to pose the question. Part of it could be habit formation and the types of giving traditionally associated with philanthropy. At one point, religion was capturing 50% of the philanthropic market overall. So there's a bit of decline there. Are there other avenues to give? Is it through investing power or purchasing power? So I think there's a whole host of considerations there. But I think when there is a clear vision and a clear, unique value proposition, a philanthropic value proposition, and there are champions to go forward and make that direct request, I think at an individual organizational level, that there are a number of strategies that can be taken.
Perfect, thank you. And kind of piggybacking off of that, we had 2 very similar questions come in. around limited resources, right? So limited resources for new staff. So are NPOs focusing their fundraising investment into major giving with higher margins and possibly away from lower level annual membership and direct mail giving? And another question very similar to that was, is it worth the effort to get those small donors back for morale reasons, or is it time to, or is time best spent catering to those big donors?
Yeah, I mean, we all, right, have to deal with the challenge of trade-offs when we have limited resources, which all of us have, right? We all have limited time, limited money, limited attention. I sort of feel like that. So if those are the two choices, the effort to get more, and I'll characterize them this way, everyday donors, right? So more of them, but at a lower dollar amount, compared to the effort to go after the individuals where fewer people, but each one bigger gifts, and kind of what's the ROI with both. I think, Greg, just given his tremendous experience, can talk about it through a fundraising lens. I'll talk about it in terms of the trade-offs from a DEI perspective, which is the more stakeholders you have, and the more they resemble the folks you're trying to serve, the more inclusive your institution will be, and the more likely you'll be to find those inclusive solutions. But that takes time and energy. So if you are going after a few very wealthy people as your supporters, that may be more efficient from a pure financial standpoint, but that also means that the folks who have skin in the game for your institution are a much smaller set of individuals, right? And so your institution will necessarily be more heavily influenced by fewer people, which is the opposite of a more inclusive situation. So that's more from a sort of social impact lens, but I'll pass it on to Greg to think about it more from a sort of the practical nature of fundraising.
No, I'm with you, Kat, on this, and I am mindful of time, but it's such a thoughtful response that you offered there, and it's almost an impossible question, right? Or solve, and it really depends on what is the intention or what is the objective. If it's to raise immediate dollars in the near term over a 6-month or 12-month or 24-month period, it's going to be moving in a major gifts territory. But is it just that? Because ideally, the organization is going to be around for more than those 6 to 12 to 18 to 24 months. And you can't have one without the other. So diversifying the pipeline, building the pipeline, Pat, in addition, just from a fundraising perspective, as well as to your point, from a mission fulfillment perspective and from a strategic imperative perspective, from a societal and social impact perspective. So I think it really depends on, okay, are we playing the long game? Are we here for the long run? Or are we just trying to solve an immediate problem or address an immediate opportunity or emergency? And then I think that includes a shifting of resources.
And Cara, I'm just seeing the questions that remain, and I will offer this. I realize I blurted out a whole bunch of free resources in my responses, which I'm happy to give the list of folks. And then if there's a follow-up message that goes to participants, hopefully that's a way that we can get them.
Yes, I was actually just going to suggest that we'll get that list of links and resources that you mentioned, and we'll send those along so that in our follow-up communication that'll go out tomorrow, we'll be sure to send those all in there. Thank you. So I think we have time for one last question, Greg and Kat, and I think you'll enjoy it. What excites you most about the philanthropic landscape in the year ahead?
So for me, it's really one of the great privileges of working where I work at a university. And maybe it's not even just like next year, it's sort of looking ahead at the philanthropic sector. I remember when I came to launch the center 17 years ago, there would be students who would sort of make their way to the center and be confused and think we were in the business of what Greg's in the fundraising. It's like, no, that's the other side of the equation. And it's almost like they couldn't wrap their head around a center whose focus was on advancing the field of philanthropy. Contrast that to, I mentioned Aaron's work, Chariot, where I have a Penn student who left his very high-paying consulting job because he saw an opportunity to bring more efficiency and effectiveness to the philanthropic sector. That's 17 years, and the difference in the amount of creativity and where that's coming from and commitment to strengthening the sector, that is super exciting and inspiring to me.
It's really powerful, Kat. Thank you for sharing that, and Kara for your question. And I know we're at time, but similar to Kat, I mean, just the innovation that's happening in this space and the new solution sets between private and public and philanthropic investments, and an opportunity to serve our client partners and collaborate with our colleagues and to really help advance many of the incredible causes in our communities is all inspiring and energizing. So very much appreciate the question. And it was terrific to spend this time with you, Kat, to be continued at a different place. And we'll have a 2.0 version. And Kara, of course, to you and your team and the whole group at CCS, and to the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and to everybody who has been with us for this hour. Thank you all so much.